let's talk about ride-sharing apps in Colombia. Hi all, I'm Ezrado and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. So for those uninitiated, Uber and other ride-sharing apps have been a bit of a controversy in Colombia. They basically operate in a legal grey area there, so some will tell you it's illegal, others will tell you that it's within your rights to use, but one thing's for certain, it's all a big mess that warrants an entire video to unpack fully, which is what I'm going to do today. Now I have explained this a little bit in past videos, but I didn't really have the time to discuss every last detail, so I figured I'd just make this one video that I can point to if the topic ever comes up again. Alright, so this fiasco begins in the year 2020. Uber had been operating in Colombia for several years, but had become a controversy among taxi drivers as they were taking a lot of their market share. Now obviously this happens virtually anywhere that Uber operates, but it was especially the case in Colombia as Uber supposedly had one big competitive advantage, and that was that they could operate without a taxi license. See, in Colombia, in order for taxis to be legally allowed to operate, they need a special medallion that's made artificially scarce by the government in order to drive up its cost. To obtain it, drivers need to pay upwards of $27,000, which is a lot of money even by first world standards, but in Colombian pesos, that's an astronomical cost. In order to help pay it off over time, taxi drivers supposedly end up charging their passengers more. Uber drivers, on the other hand, who don't have anything like this to pay off, obviously don't need to pass anything like that on to their passengers, and therefore they're supposedly a lot cheaper, giving them a competitive advantage. You'll notice I'm using the word supposedly a lot, and that's because, in my opinion, I don't think taxis are actually much more expensive. In fact, a lot of the time they're cheaper, but even when they're not, I don't think the price is necessarily why people often choose Uber over taxis in the first place, and I'll get to that in a bit. The point is though that taxi companies felt this was an issue to the point of filing a lawsuit about it, citing that Uber had broken fair competition laws. The court sided with this, and in 2020 they ordered Uber to cease operating in the country. They were still allowed to have their app available, but they were banned from offering rideshare services. After a short while though, Uber came back after discovering a legal loophole in this. Rather than continuing as a rideshare service, they now consider themselves in Colombia to be a vehicle rental search engine, where each vehicle happens to come with a driver. Also, every time you rent a vehicle through Uber in Colombia, you're actually entering a private contract between you and the driver, of whom Uber have no affiliation with beyond just being the search engine you found them through. I know that's a weird thing to wrap your head around, but the point is that now when you get an Uber in Colombia, it's no longer technically an Uber, and that is what has technically legally allowed them to continue operating despite having been banned from the country. It's worth noting that whilst they have this loophole that's allowing them to operate without disobeying the court's decision, you will find that police do still penalise Uber drivers in certain instances. Honestly though, this is almost always just at the airport where they like to reserve space for taxis and shuttle buses. There are also a lot of cities where Uber is virtually non-existent, and anyone who tries to bring it to those places can get into trouble if caught. But in any city where it's even just somewhat established, you're highly unlikely to have any problems. Still, you might be wondering why any police at all would have any issues if Uber's legal, and to be honest, I really can't give you a straight answer on that. I find sometimes that Colombian authorities can enforce things at their own discretion and have a bit of leeway to police the spirit of the law rather than just the technicalities. I have talked about this a bit already in a previous video I did on strange Colombia laws, so if that interests you, I'll put a link here or in the description. Getting back to Uber though, this is pretty much where it's been at for the last few years, although there have been a few recent developments. Towards the end of 2022, the newly elected president Gustavo Petro announced a bill that would force Uber and other rideshare apps to be blocked from the country. This decision would have affected around 100,000 households who rely on income from these apps, but thankfully it was quickly reversed based on net neutrality legislation. On March 1st, 2023 though, a draft bill circulated on Twitter that noted transport in Colombia legally must be a regulated, monitored and controlled service of the state. The bill therefore proposed a new system where rideshare drivers would be sanctioned if discovered by authorities. It specifically states that if a driver drives a vehicle and provides a service different from the one for which they have a traffic license, they will be subject to the sanctions. These include fines beginning at $240 and the suspension of the driver's vehicle for 5 to 40 days depending on how many times they've been caught. So in short, as Transport Minister Guillermo Reyes puts it, public transport in private vehicles is now prohibited in Colombia. Now, in my opinion, this might not be as straightforward as it first appears. The target people of the bill that I mentioned, drivers who provide a service different from the one for which they have a traffic license, isn't an entirely clear definition. I mean, I can see that they're trying to differentiate taxi drivers and regular drivers and say that people who don't have a taxi license shouldn't be providing a taxi-like service, but where the line is drawn on what is and isn't a taxi-like service isn't totally obvious. I mean, what if you're just paying your friend to drive you places? Would that be subject to sanctions? Obviously not, that's just between you and your friends, so I don't see why the government should get involved. So you might say it's only in commercial settings where the driver isn't your friend where it's illegal, but then how do you define them as a friend or not? I mean, I had an Uber driver who I paid in Colombia, and maybe it was more of a commercial transaction to begin with, but we got along pretty well and I hung out with them enough for me to be comfortable calling them a friend, and I started paying them as a personal driver outside of Uber, so where would something like that fit into the equation? And I think at this point you just got to admit, okay, when it comes to paying someone privately who isn't employed by any company but is just personally offering lifts for some simple cash in hand, does the government really have any say in this? And then you realize, oh wait, that's what Uber is under its current terms, which again brings me back to my point. Where is the line here? Alright, so I'm no lawyer, and admittedly I don't know how much weight these queries hold, but one thing I can definitely point to as contradictory is the government's multiple stances on this. See, whilst they have had this draft bill that may or may not get passed, they've also been talking about regulating these services. At the same time all of this has been happening, there's been another draft bill floating around regarding labour reform for gig economy platforms like Uber, and yes, it specifically includes rideshare services in the document. In other words, the government's also proposed legislation where they'd be regulating these platforms instead of outright banning them. Beyond that, though, Transport Minister Guillermo Reyes, the same person I mentioned earlier, who said public transport in private vehicles is now prohibited in Colombia, also said, and I quote, "We are not going to ban these platforms. What we need is to reach consensus on how to formalize them so that they offer their services legally." He also assured that nothing would be sent to Congress until a consensus is met between all parties, including spokespeople of the rideshare companies. So you can see how this is confusing, right? It's like, hey you, Uber driver, ride-sharing's illegal. Well, that's a weird thing to ban, but whatever. Oh no, we haven't banned it. Okay, well I guess I'll keep using it then. No, stop, you're banned from using it. Fine, I guess if it's illegal, I probably shouldn't use it anyway. Oh no, don't worry, we're gonna regulate it so it's totally legal. Oh great, so I can use it now? Yep, and we're also planning on sanctioning you for it. Okay, goodbye. Anyway, at the time of recording, that's where it's all at the moment, but if there are any meaningful updates that make this video redundant, I'll make another video about it and link it in the description. Now, in terms of my personal opinion on this whole fandango, in case you hadn't already guessed, I think it's a whole lot of unnecessary hoopla. Honestly, as I said earlier in the video, I'm not even convinced that Uber being marginally cheaper than taxis gives them much of a competitive advantage. Like, let's face it, the real reason they're giving taxis a run for their money is because they offer a better service, and taxi companies just don't want to admit it. Uber's is safer, the price is set before you get on, the car doesn't feel like it's going to fall apart at any moment like it does with taxis, and most crucially, it's easier and quicker to get a driver on Uber than it is on taxi apps. From my experience, I can say the likelihood of you getting a ride with a taxi when you're using a taxi app is way lower compared to Uber, and if you hail a taxi instead, there's always that small risk that you might get something fake, and in a worst case scenario, be held by the driver for extortion, which yes, is something that has been known to happen, particularly in Bogota. With all of that being said, you can see why losing Uber and ride sharing altogether really wouldn't be a good thing to happen in Colombia. Unless taxis significantly lift their game, ride-sharing is far and away the best means of local transport in the country, and I can say from experience between when I was in a city that had Uber and a city that didn't, you will feel the difference. To close this video though, I just wanted to summarize what the important takeaways are. First of all, you can use these platforms in cities where they're widespread and feel confident that you're not going to run into trouble. As I said, the only exception would be the airport, but anywhere else, and you'll likely find that police rarely patrol this, and many don't even care. I even had a policeman help me get an Uber once from a police station when I had my phone stolen, so you really don't have much to worry about. Even from a legal perspective, you gotta remember that Uber wouldn't operate in Colombia if it were illegal for them. Like, that's just not something an international Fortune 500 company can do so openly and brazenly. They have way too much to lose. Even if they're only able to operate based on a technicality in the law, it's a loophole nonetheless, and so they're unlikely to be breaking any hard-written legislation. Even considering what the Transport Minister said about how it's illegal to use private vehicles as public transport, or the bill that mentioned the illegality of operating outside of a traffic license for non-taxi drivers, As I illustrated earlier, these things aren't super definable and specific enough to constitute as concrete legislation, in my opinion. At the end of the day, the way I see it, the government's not banning these apps, they're talking about regulating them. There is a draft bill floating around about sanctions that contradicts this, but nothing's been settled yet to my knowledge. In summary, as I said at the beginning, one thing's for certain, this is all a giant mess. And to that end, I'll leave it to you to make of it what you will and do what you choose. If you're interested in reading about this for yourself though, I've listed all of my sources in the description. With that, I'm going to end this one here. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.